The knock came soft. Too soft. Anna van der Meer pressed her spine against the cold plaster wall of her cellar apartment and held her breath. 8 months since liberation, and still the body remembered occupation. Still the heart clenched at the sound of knuckles on wood. The voice that followed spoke English with an accent she couldn't place, flat vowels, stretched consonants, neither British nor Canadian.
Huh?
Relief distribution. We have rations. She opened the door to a boy in olive drab holding a cardboard box stamped with a 5-point star. He couldn't have been 20. He smiled. He asked permission to enter. They had been told the Americans were loud, brash, chewing gum and overconfidence in equal measure. The first word he said to her was please. The war had taught them to expect machinery. What arrived was manners. The scene repeated itself across the Western Netherlands through that strange spring of 1945, a season suspended between catastrophe and reconstruction, between the Hongerwinter's last deaths and the first tentative harvests of peace. American forces had poured into the liberated zones not as conquerors but as quartermasters of mercy, their trucks heavy with flour and condensed milk, their field kitchens turning out hot meals in town squares still cratered by German demolitions. The Dutch had survived the famine. 22,000 had not. Those who remained watched the Americans with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment, trying to reconcile propaganda with presence, expectation with experience. By the time Anna opened her door that May morning, over 40,000 American personnel were operating in the Netherlands, engineers repairing bridges, medical teams inoculating children, logistics officers coordinating the vast choreography of humanitarian relief. They worked with a combination of industrial efficiency and deliberate gentleness that left the Dutch uncertain how to respond. In her diary that night, Anna wrote 3 sentences. Asterisk, they apologized for the spam. They asked if the coffee was too strong. I had forgotten men could speak without commanding. Asterisk. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. Anna had not been a prisoner in the conventional sense. She had never seen the inside of a camp, never worn a number, never stood for apple in the frozen dark. But the Hongerwinter had imprisoned the entire population of Western Holland, turning cities into open-air cages where food became currency and desperation eroded the last pretenses of civilization. The German occupation had stripped the region methodically, first Jews, then able-bodied men for labor conscription, then bicycles, then copper, then hope. By November 1944, the rations had fallen below survival levels. By January, people were eating tulip bulbs and sugar beets meant for livestock. By March, the Municipal Records Office in Amsterdam was burning furniture to keep the death certificates from freezing to the desks. Anna's husband had been taken in the Rotterdam Roundup of 1944, shipped east to work the factories of the Ruhr. She had no word of him, no letter, no name on a Red Cross list, no body. She had 2 children, Peter, 9, and Lise, 6. She kept them alive on nettle soup and the occasional black market potato purchased with her mother's wedding ring. When the Canadians liberated the northern provinces in April, the German forces in the west had negotiated a truce to allow relief supplies through. The Allies dropped food from the air, Operation Mena, Operation Chowhound, pallets tumbling from Lancaster bombers into fields turned into improvised landing zones. But it was the Americans who came through the door. The first convoys arrived the second week of May, a rolling parade of deuce and a halfs and Studebakers, their canvas sides painted with white stars, their beds stacked with crates of sea rations and 5-gallon tins of lard. The Dutch had lined the roadsides to watch them pass, not cheering, not yet, still too weak for celebration, but standing because standing itself was a form of testimony. The trucks smelled of diesel and new paint and something indefinable, something the Dutch would later describe as abundant star. Not wealth. Not luxury. Just the sheer material reality of a nation that had not been bled. The Americans set up distribution centers in school gymnasiums and church basements, unfolding trestle tables and arranging the goods with a precision that suggested training. White bread. Canned peaches. Powdered eggs. Chocolate bars in brown wrappers that snapped when you bent them. The Dutch formed lines without being told, old instincts of order reasserting themselves, and the Americans handed out the supplies with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. No shoving. No favoritism. Each family received the same allotment, logged in triplicate on mimeographed forms. A sergeant from Michigan, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, counted tins of corned beef into Anna's outstretched arms and then added an extra. For the kids, he said. She didn't know how to thank him. She tried in Dutch, then broken German, then fell silent. He nodded as if he understood. That night, Peter tasted chocolate for the first time in 18 months. He held the square on his tongue until it melted, his eyes closed, and then asked his mother if the war was truly over. She told him she thought it might be. The pivot came not in the food itself but in the gestures that framed it. The Americans did not distribute relief as charity but as restitution, a debt owed by the free to the occupied. They did not demand gratitude. They did not lecture. They worked with a quiet urgency that suggested moral obligation rather than political theater. A medic from Ohio set up a field clinic in a bombed-out bakery and spent 14 hours a day treating cases of edema and scurvy, his hands gentle on children's swollen bellies, his voice soft with apology for every needle prick. A chaplain from Tennessee walked the rows of a makeshift cemetery, recording names in a leather notebook so that the dead would not be lost to bureaucracy. A lieutenant from Brooklyn stood in the rain directing traffic at a destroyed bridge, his uniform soaked through, waving trucks forward with exaggerated politeness as if he were working a Manhattan intersection on a Sunday morning. Anna received a blanket on her third visit to the distribution center, thick wool, olive green, stamped with U.S. Army in black stencil. The soldier who handed it to her, a boy with red hair and freckles, folded it twice before placing it in her arms, as if presentation mattered. She carried it home in silence, Liz's small hand tucked into hers, and that night she wrapped both children in it and listened to them sleep without shivering for the first time since autumn. In her diary she wrote, "They gave us warmth before they gave us answers. Perhaps that is the correct order." The gesture had shifted something fundamental. The Germans had made them beg. The Canadians had made them wait. The Americans simply gave, and in giving restored a kind of dignity the Dutch had believed irretrievable. A black and white cinematic image of military trucks stopped at Market Square edge, exhaust curling in morning air, 12 German women prisoners sitting rigid inside on wooden benches, June 1945 Yorkshire, World War II documentary realism. A black and white cinematic image of British corporal unlatching truck tailgate, German women prisoners stepping out tentatively onto cobblestones, testing each footfall. Watchful caution visible, Market Square arrival moment, historical photography aesthetic. A black and white cinematic image of Yorkshire Market Square from prisoner's perspective, vegetables in wooden crates, bread on cloth-covered tables, eggs in straw, meat hanging from hooks, abundance overwhelming, June 1945 England. A black and white cinematic image of German signals operator stopping mid-step staring at market, mouth opening then closing, looking between corporal and impossible food, disbelief visible. Contradiction registered, documentary emotion. A black and white cinematic image of market woman in apron weighing apples at stall, shopfront with striped awning, mourning customers, ordinary life persisting, Yorkshire 1945, stubborn normalcy contradicting propaganda, historical realism. A black and white cinematic image of German women prisoners in grey threadbare uniforms walking toward British lines with hands raised, column of 30 exhausted faces, May 1945 surrender, professional enemy reception. Capture flashback moment. A black and white cinematic image of young British soldier offering cigarette to suspicious German prisoner, another prisoner taking it with shaking hands, first gesture of unexpected civility, processing center, methodical kindness documented. A black and white cinematic image of military truck driving through war-scarred landscape, burned vehicles and shelled farmhouses visible, German prisoners watching from rolled-back canvas cover, transit through destruction toward safety. Historical journey. A black and white cinematic image of Yorkshire countryside from moving truck, stone walls and hedgerows with elderflower, sheep grazing, absence of shell craters, untouched landscape contradicting expectation, June 1945 England. A black and white cinematic image of British corporal leading German prisoners to vegetable stall, middle-aged woman in floral dress presiding over crates, Market Square Centre, instruction moment. June 1945 Yorkshire documentary style. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoner pointing hesitantly at cabbage, British market woman weighing it, corporal translating, first autonomous choice in captivity, small monumental gesture, documentary intimacy captured. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoner holding head of cabbage with both hands as if might vanish, overwhelming emotion at ordinary transaction, market stall setting. June 1945 restoration moment. A black and white cinematic image of German medic receiving 3 eggs from elderly Yorkshire farmer, hands cradling them like glass, free gift across enemy line, market stall exchange, unexpected mercy documented. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoners moving between market stalls selecting vegetables, touching produce hesitantly then with confidence, British corporal supervising not unkindly, accumulation of normalcy. Documentary realism. A black and white cinematic image of morning roll call in POW camp courtyard, German women prisoners in formation, British officer walking lines counting heads, June 1945 Northern England, routine establishing reliability, historical authenticity. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoners at breakfast table eating porridge and bread with margarine, teacups steaming, same meal every morning, communal mess hall, monotonous reliability as grace, wartime documentation. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoners on work detail in camp, peeling vegetables and mending uniforms, British sergeant supervising with gruff fairness, physical labor. Not punishing, routine June 1945 afternoon. A black and white cinematic image of British sergeant carrying collapsed German prisoner to camp infirmary, barking orders at medic, unexpected care transcending duty, afternoon emergency, documentary compassion visible, Yorkshire camp interior. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoners in barracks evening, some playing cards, some reading donated books, some writing letters home, quiet autonomous time, camp library visible, post-war. Correspondence ritual. A black and white cinematic image of German school teacher prisoner writing in diary by lamplight, concentrated expression processing market experience, barracks bunk, Sunday evening, ideological reckoning documented through writing, historical intimacy. A black and white cinematic image of British nurse conducting medical inspection in barracks, checking German prisoners for illness, professional efficiency, shared profession revelation moment, afternoon light, mutual recognition across conflict. A black and white cinematic image of two women, British nurse and German prisoner, standing facing each other, both former teachers, silent moment of connection, barracks interior, shared humanity transcending war, documentary emotion. A black and white cinematic image of snow-covered POW camp at Christmas 1945, barracks roofs dusted white, courtyard silent under frost blanket, pine boughs and paper stars visible through mess hall window, transformation moment. A black and white cinematic image of Christmas service in mess hall, British chaplain speaking with German prisoner translating beside him, pine decorations and paper stars overhead, December 1945 peace message, documentary reverence. A black and white cinematic image of Christmas meal with German prisoners and British guards sharing long tables, passing plates, pouring tea, together not as overseers and captives but as humans, December 1945 humanity enacted. A black and white cinematic image of British sergeant teaching German prisoner Yorkshire carol, both laughing, Christmas gathering, cultural bridge through song, mess hall warmth, December 1945 joy transcending conflict documented. A black and white cinematic image of young British soldier playing harmonica while German prisoners sing Silent Night in German, voices filling hall, paper stars overhead, collective remembrance. Christmas 1945 evening documentary aesthetic. A black and white cinematic image of German prisoner working as translator in British occupation office, post-war civilian clothes, 1946 England, repatriation alternative, new life beginning, documentary transition captured. A black and white cinematic image of former German prisoner writing letter at boarding house table in York, maintaining correspondence with other survivors, 1946 England, connection through memory, post-war processing documented. A black and white cinematic image of former prisoner returning to settle Market Square in 1950, now as civilian visitor, same cobblestones and stalls, 5 years later pilgrimage, remembrance journey, historical closure. A black and white cinematic image of former prisoner buying eggs at market stall from younger man, careful English conversation, carrying wicker basket, 1950 England, completing circle of mercy, documentary epilogue aesthetic. A black and white cinematic image of woman making omelette in small rented room, eggs in pan, solitary meal with profound meaning, evening light, tin cup from camp, visible on shelf, symbolic sustenance documented, historical reflection frame. Captured the small revelations of reconstruction, the day the electricity returned, humming to life at noon with no warning, causing half the city to weep. The morning a water truck arrived and American engineers spent 6 hours repairing a broken main, refusing tea or food, working in silence until the pipes flowed clean. The afternoon a jazz band, a real band, with a trumpet and a saxophone, set up in the town square and played for 3 hours while Dutch civilians stood in the drizzle and listened to music they had never heard before, rhythms that felt like a language from another planet. Margreet wrote, "They are teaching us how to hope. Not with words, they are terrible with words, earnest and fumbling, but with consistency. The food arrives. The water flows. The lights turn on. After 6 years of promises broken and orders reversed, this dependability feels like a new kind of power." She encountered an American lieutenant one morning outside the school where she taught. The building had been used as a German barracks during the occupation, and the classrooms still bore the scars, swastikas carved into desks, propaganda posters peeling from the walls. The lieutenant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, introduced himself as a former high school history teacher from Wisconsin. He asked if she needed help preparing the school for reopening. She said yes, expecting a work detail and official forms. Instead, he returned the next day with a squad of soldiers and a truckload of supplies: paint, brushes, lumber, soap. They spent 2 days scrubbing floors and whitewashing walls, working alongside Dutch volunteers, and when they finished, the lieutenant presented Margreet with a box of textbooks, American history, geography, mathematics, and told her they were a gift, no strings attached. She asked why. He said something about the future depending on education, but his Dutch was terrible and his English too fast, and finally he just shrugged and smiled and said, because kids should have books. The school reopened in June. The desk smelled of fresh paint. Henk van Aalst, 19, had spent the Hongerwinter stealing coal from the rail yards to keep his grandmother alive. He had expected liberation to mean arrests, interrogations, punishment for the 100 small crimes survival had demanded. Instead, he found himself employed by the Americans as a driver, ferrying supplies between distribution centers in a battered Ford truck that ran on gasoline so clean it seemed almost decadent. The Americans had hired him without questions, without background checks, simply because he spoke passable English and knew the roads. They paid him in scrip and cigarettes and treated him like an employee, not a suspect. He drove for a sergeant named Kowalski, a stocky man from Pennsylvania who chewed tobacco and called everyone buddy regardless of rank or nationality. Kowalski taught Henk how to double-clutch the Ford, how to navigate washed-out roads, how to read military maps. They delivered crates of medical supplies to field hospitals and sacks of flour to orphanages and boxes of soap to municipal depots. Once, outside Gouda, they stopped to help a Dutch family whose cart had broken an axle. Kowalski spent an hour improvising a repair with wire and a piece of lumber, refusing payment, refusing even thanks, and when they drove away, Henk asked him why he bothered. Kowalski said, because we can. It was not an answer that made sense, but Henk thought about it for days. One evening, parked outside a warehouse while waiting for a shipment manifest, Kowalski pulled out a photograph, his wife and 2 daughters, standing in front of a white house with a porch, and showed it to Henk with a kind of shy pride. Pittsburgh, he said. Steel town. Good people. He asked if Henk had family. Henk said his parents were dead, his grandmother dying, his sister vanished into Germany with a labor draft. Kowalski folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his wallet. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply handed Henk a Hershey bar and said, split it with your grandma. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, and yet it implied a future, a world where chocolate could be shared, where grandmothers recovered, where loss did not have to be permanent. Henk wrote in a letter to his sister, wherever she was, * they treat us like we are still people. I had forgotten what that felt like. *. The ideological reckoning came quietly, in fragments and contradictions rather than grand pronouncements. The Dutch had been told by German propaganda that the Americans were barbarians, racially impure, culturally degenerate, morally bankrupt. The occupation had reinforced these narratives with newsreels of jazz clubs and race riots, with posters depicting American soldiers as ape-like caricatures, with radio broadcasts warning that liberation would bring chaos and exploitation. The NSB had preached that the Reich represented order, discipline, civilization itself, and that the Allies were coming to loot and destroy. The reality dismantled the propaganda not through argument but through presence. The Americans who arrived in the Netherlands were polite, organized, and strikingly diverse. Black soldiers worked alongside white. Jewish chaplains conducted services in requisitioned churches. Japanese-American engineers repaired infrastructure their family's country of origin had been fighting against. The Dutch watched this plurality and tried to reconcile it with the narratives they had been fed. A woman in Harlem, watching a black medic treat her son's infected leg with a patience and skill that belied every racist slur she had heard, wrote in her diary, * I was taught to fear them. I was wrong. *. The Americans did not preach democracy. They performed it. In meetings with Dutch officials, they solicited opinions rather than issuing commands. When distributing supplies, they consulted local leaders about need rather than imposing allocations from above. They apologized for delays and shortages, a habit the Dutch found disorienting. Apology implied accountability, and accountability implied equality. The occupiers had never apologized. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe, the next scene will challenge you even more. A moment of transformation came in late June, during a coordination meeting between American relief officers and Dutch municipal authorities in Utrecht. The discussion concerned the allocation of building materials for housing reconstruction. A Dutch alderman, a former resistance member, argued passionately for prioritizing the homes of resistance families over collaborators. Major Hartman listened carefully, then explained that American policy did not permit discrimination based on wartime allegiance, that housing, like food and medicine, was a right that transcended politics. The alderman erupted, accusing the Americans of moral cowardice, of equating victims with perpetrators. Hartman did not raise her voice. She simply pointed out that justice required courts, evidence, due process, not starvation and homelessness. "We are not here to take sides," she said. "We are here to rebuild a society where taking sides is no longer necessary." The alderman left the meeting furious. But 2 weeks later, when the first housing materials arrived and were distributed exactly as Hartman had promised, fairly, transparently, without favoritism, he returned and offered a stiff apology. Hartman accepted it without comment. The incident became a parable, repeated in cafes and kitchens across the city. The Americans who valued procedure over revenge, who believed systems could be stronger than sentiment. Christmas 1945 arrived 8 months into liberation, and the Americans organized celebrations in a dozen cities, modest affairs, given ongoing shortages, but deliberate in their symbolism. In Rotterdam, they erected a Christmas tree in the Bomsgaard Square where the old cathedral had stood, stringing lights powered by a portable generator. Dutch children, many of whom had never celebrated Christmas with anything more than a shared potato, received gifts, wooden toys, knitted scarves, second-hand books. American soldiers, homesick and far from their own families, handed out candy and sang carols in fractured Dutch, their accents so mangled that the lyrics became unrecognizable but the sentiment remained clear. Anna attended with Peter and Lies, standing at the edge of the crowd, unwilling to push forward but unable to stay away. A chaplain, a round-faced man from Georgia, delivered a brief sermon in English that a Dutch pastor translated haltingly. Something about peace, about shared humanity, about the obligation to remember suffering without being consumed by it. Anna didn't follow all of it. But afterward, the chaplain moved through the crowd distributing small prayer cards printed with a verse in Dutch and English. He handed one to Anna, and she read it later by candlelight, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." She thought about the sergeant who had given her the extra tin of corned beef, the medic who had treated Peter's cough without charge, the lieutenant who had repaired her school. She thought about the countless small acts of decency that had accumulated over 8 months, brick by brick, into something that resembled trust. She thought about her husband, lost somewhere in the wreckage of Germany, and wondered if he had encountered similar kindness or if he had vanished into the machinery of retribution. She did not know. But she allowed herself, for the first time since his disappearance, to imagine his return, not as certainty but as possibility. In her diary that night, she wrote, "They are teaching us to believe in tomorrow. I had thought belief was a luxury. Perhaps it is a necessity." By the spring of 1946, the American presence had begun to diminish. The emergency phase of relief had ended. The Netherlands, though still scarred and struggling, had stabilized. Food production had resumed. Infrastructure was being rebuilt. The occupation's trauma would take generations to heal, but the immediate crisis had passed. The Americans began withdrawing, transferring responsibilities to Dutch authorities, packing up their field kitchens and distribution centers and portable generators. Anna saw the departure preparations at the distribution center, where soldiers were crating supplies and dismantling tables. The red-haired boy who had given her the blanket, she had learned his name was Danny, from some place called Indiana, was loading boxes into a truck. She approached him with a small package wrapped in brown paper, a pair of woolen socks she had knitted from unraveled yarn, the best she could manage. He opened it, looked at the socks, and then at her, and his eyes reddened. He said thank you in Dutch, carefully pronounced, and then hugged her, briefly, awkwardly, a gesture that crossed 100 boundaries of propriety and protocol. She let him. That evening, she wrote the longest entry in her diary, trying to capture what the 8 months had meant, what the Americans had represented. She struggled with the language, crossing out sentences, starting over. Finally, she settled on this, "They came as strangers and left as proof that strangers need not be enemies. They fed us, sheltered us, and never asked us to be grateful, only to survive. If this is what they call freedom, I think I am beginning to understand it." The legacy lingered in unexpected ways. Dutch children named their sons after American soldiers. Towns erected small plaques commemorating the relief efforts, the dates and names recorded in bronze. Veterans groups organized annual remembrances, modest ceremonies where aging Dutch citizens placed flowers at monuments and toasted absent friends with American whiskey. The memory of the Hongerwinter remained raw, but the memory of liberation acquired a gentler cast, not triumph, exactly, but restoration. A return not just to life but to the possibility of life. Henk van Aalst wrote to Sergeant Kowalski for 5 years after the war, letters that traced his reconstruction, his grandmother's recovery, his sister's return from Germany, his enrollment in technical school, his first job as a mechanic. Kowalski wrote back sporadically, his handwriting terrible, his news mundane, births, baseball scores, complaints about Pittsburgh winters. The letters were not profound. They were simply proof of connection, of a friendship that had survived the extremity that forged it. When Kowalski died in 1963, his widow sent Henk the photograph he had shown him that evening outside the warehouse, the White House, the porch, the family. On the back, Kowalski had written, *for Henk. You reminded me why we went. *.